I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus.
Mr. President, we read with interest the report of the Secretary General on the work of the organization. Obviously, the UN today is faced with a difficult choice: remain in the past framework and conduct business as usual, or move forward, taking on board the voice of each state and the needs of each state. In this context, we support the view of the Secretary General as to the need to revive the commitment to multilateralism, a principle owing to which states could pool their efforts to face up to challenges and threats. Belarus has noted on many occasions that many conflicts could have been avoided if the UN had truly been committed to the sense of unity. Using a policy of mediation at an early stage of confrontations is indeed an effective way to maintain international peace and security. In this regard, we believe the Secretary General's approach is correct in terms of focus on preventive actions to prevent conflicts. Peace building and peacekeeping must not be regarded as a purely post-conflict activity. At the same time, we understand the new time brings new threats and challenges. In this context, we commend the initiative of the President of the Republic of Belarus to launch a new Helsinki process, which could become a platform for dialogue to overcome differences among states in the world. Summing up the past year, we note the active work of the Secretary General in reorganizing the United Nations. In this regard, we trust the Secretary General. He is an experienced international official. At the same time, we believe that reorganizing the UN must not be conducted without the broadest participation of member states. Consultations must be attended by all states, not only donor countries, because we're convinced that the functioning of the UN in a new way is particularly important to the countries that are recipients of assistance. We are convinced that it is only through common joint efforts that we are going to be able to carry out what we plan to carry out in effective ways, ways acceptable to all. As a result of the reorganization, we must not lose the advantages of the system that have proved themselves in practice. We believe it's also extremely important to rule out additional financial and bureaucratic burdens for member states, ensure a smooth, well-coordinated functioning of the UN agencies on the ground, definitely keeping the principle of the full compliance with the national priorities of member states and the work of the UN. We welcome the Secretary General's efforts to reactivate the peace and security work at the UN Secretariat. The initiatives striving to raise the potential of the UN peacekeeping forces and adapt their configuration to the contemporary context are worthy of broad support. It's important, however, in improving peacekeeping operation to make sure that we do not turn the process of technical reorganization into an end to itself, not to get bogged in bureaucratic rearrangements, not to allow arbitrary broadening or reduction of the mandates of the key bodies of the United Nations. Our joint and, most importantly, coordinated efforts should result in keeping peace and security in the most vulnerable regions. The gender aspect of the peacekeeping missions of the United Nations is of great significance in improving the current paradigm of peace and security. In this regard, the Secretary General initiative to enhance the role of women in peacekeeping must be very highly commended. We, the Republic of Belarus, are part of this work. The Belarusian specialists that form part of the UN provisional forces in the Lebanon include women, and women are very successful there. We agree with the UN Secretary General in that while the process of the growth in development indicators continues, there's a danger that global stability could be undermined. This is a topical issue. The UN must orient itself toward a more individual approach, the solution of individual problems, taking into account the specificity of each country. We believe that it is high time for the UN to recognize the group of middle-income countries. To date, this group has not been factored into the systemic activity of our organization, and there's no coordinated mechanism of assisting such countries. We're talking here about more than 100 countries. The majority of the world's population lives in these countries. They account for 1/3 of the world's GDP, 1/4 of export and import. 73% of poor people also live in middle-income countries. We hope that the UN Secretariat will support the development of a strategy for the UN to help middle-income countries on the basis of similar documents that already exist for other categories of developing countries. Without taking this category of countries and their interests into account, we will not be able to accomplish the 2030 agenda. We would also like to dwell on certain processes currently underway within the United Nations. That part of it, which has to do with the routine interaction between states and the Secretariat of the United Nations. A clear and open framework for such interaction would ensure successful work for the needs of the countries. Unfortunately, there's no less red tape in the work with the Secretariat. We're still faced with a situation where the Secretariat fails to hear the states' voices in terms of simplifying the work to service states. Unilateral introduction of new rules that address the technical aspects of the work of the UN Secretariat often greatly complicates the day-to-day practical work of states at headquarters, forcing us to focus on technical, logistical issues instead of addressing substantive tasks. A cumbersome procedure exists, and we still need to pay for it in terms of organizing events at the UN on behalf of states. The wish of the Secretariat to free itself of its direct administrative functions has forced member states to create a mechanism to improve interaction between the Secretariat and the missions of member states. Great attention is paid by the mission to this mechanism, and we've seen that throughout the past session, and that reaffirms the need to do away with the baggage of issues which very often rely on the readiness of the Secretariat to react to constructive criticism or the suggestions coming from missions. We would also like to mention the format for considering items of the agenda, specifically agenda item 110, which we are currently considering, the report of the Secretary General on the work of the organization. Today, as in previous years, only countries, member states, are participating in the debate. The Secretary General, for some reasons, presented his report under agenda item 8, general debate. We think this is the wrong approach. Furthermore, agenda item 8 always has its own topic, its own theme, determined by the Secretary General, by the President of the General Assembly every year. And we think the Secretary General must stick to that topic and present his report under the appropriate agenda item. Maybe some of you would say these are details, that it's just practice that has been adhered to over the years. But this kind of practice, loose practice, I would say, the unwillingness to follow the rules and laws we adopted ourselves, lead to indifference, then misunderstanding, and then possibly conflicts, which all of us would like to avoid. Nor should we forget that the UN is us, states. We shouldn't talk about the UN as some kind of artificial organism that has a life of its own. When we start fully identifying ourselves with the UN and feel that the UN belongs to all states with no exception, only then shall we learn to talk and hear each other and agree, rather than trade verbal exercises or accusations. Only then shall we be able to get rid of the persistent criticism that the UN cannot adequately respond to threats and challenges. Only then shall we make this organization truly helpful and useful to all those who need it. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belarus.